billionaire's hand froze mid-signature. Michael Robbins had dismantled 23 companies that quarter without hesitation. He had crushed boardroom rivals, obliterated negotiations, and built his legend as Manhattan's most ruthless real estate emperor. But now, staring at the security footage on his tablet, the air caught in his throat. The new housekeeper was polishing the marble counter in his kitchen. Nothing unusual, except for the ring on her finger. Not platinum, not diamond. Just a crude twist of copper wire wrapped around a chipped piece of blue glass. A ring he had fashioned with his own trembling hands 20 years ago in a Baltimore orphanage for a girl he had sworn to marry. Michael Robbins owned half of the East Coast's prime real estate. His penthouse commanded a view of the entire Manhattan skyline. His signature closed billion-dollar deals before lunch. His wealth eclipsed what entire families could accumulate across generations. Yet, he couldn't sleep. Every night he lay awake in his custom Italian bed, surrounded by 1,200 thread count sheets and cathedral silence, eyes fixed on the ceiling until sunrise bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His physician prescribed industrial-strength sedatives. His psychiatrist recommended cognitive therapy. Nothing touched the insomnia. Control. That was Michael's oxygen. Control over every variable in his existence, from the exact brew temperature of his espresso to the precise positioning of every document on his desk. That was why he had terminated his entire household staff 3 weeks prior. Someone had leaked confidential information to the press. He never discovered the culprit, and so he eliminated every possibility. His chief of staff, a perpetually anxious woman named Rebecca, had delivered a thick folder of applications for a new housekeeper. "I need someone who doesn't exist," Michael had said, eyes never leaving his acquisition reports. "Someone who won't speak unless spoken to, won't pry, won't attempt to forge some connection with me, someone completely invisible." Rebecca had located exactly that. Janie Lopez, 38 years old, 17 years serving New York's most demanding elite households. Not a single negative reference in her immaculate file. Not a single former employer who could recall specific details about her face. Perfect. Janie arrived on a Wednesday morning carrying a worn canvas bag and wearing a plain charcoal dress. Michael didn't acknowledge her arrival. That he had Rebecca escort her to the staff quarters and outline the non-negotiable rules. No conversation unless directly addressed. No presence in any room he occupied. No personal items in shared spaces. She nodded once, a single, almost imperceptible movement, and began her work. For the first 5 days, Michael barely registered her existence. She moved through his 8,000-square-foot penthouse like a whisper, cleaning surfaces he hadn't realized needed attention, organizing spaces he'd forgotten were cluttered. He would walk into a room and sense it had been transformed, though he couldn't identify what had actually changed. The lighting felt warmer somehow. The air carried a subtle fragrance he couldn't place, but found strangely soothing. His meals materialized at perfect intervals, simple, nourishing dishes that triggered memories he couldn't quite grasp. On the 6th night, Michael Robbins slept for 7 unbroken hours. He woke disoriented, almost panicked. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened. Not since he was a boy. Not since before the Robbins family had chosen him from St. Catherine's Home for Children and renamed him from the name the orphanage had given him. That afternoon, Michael did something he never did. He reviewed the security footage. It was habit from his corporate paranoia, a compulsion to monitor every angle of his domain. He scrolled through hours of silent recordings, Janie moving through rooms, straightening pillows, wiping counters, folding linens with mechanical precision. Then his finger stopped on the trackpad. The timestamp read, 2:47 p.m. kitchen. Janie was standing at the sink, her back to the camera washing a glass. Her movements were efficient, practiced, invisible. But as she reached for the dish soap, her left hand came into full view under the recessed lighting. And there it was, the copper ring. Michael's chest constricted, the room tilted. 20 years collapsed into a single moment. He had made that ring on a February night when he was 11 years old, shivering on the fire escape of St. Catherine's with a girl who had saved half her dinner roll to give him because she knew the older boys had stolen his. He had twisted copper wire he'd found in the building's electrical room around a piece of blue glass from a broken soda bottle, working his fingers raw until it held together. "When I'm rich," he had whispered, slipping it onto her thin finger, "I'll marry you. I promise." 6 weeks later, the Robbins family had selected him for adoption. They had money, status, a mansion in Connecticut. They had given him everything, except permission to remember where he came from. "Your past is over," Mrs. Robbins had said, adjusting his new tie before his first day at private school. "You're a Robbins now. Act like it." So he had erased himself, Buried the orphan boy, built an empire on top of his grave, and now that boy's promise sat on the finger of a woman cleaning his kitchen in silence. Michael replayed the footage, paused it, zoomed in on her hand. The copper had oxidized to green in places. The blue glass was still chipped on one edge, but the ring was intact. Impossibly, after 20 years, she was still wearing it. His mind raced through possibilities. Coincidence? Impossible. He had made that ring himself. He twisted it with his own hands. Could it be her? Could Janie Lopez be... He pulled up her employment file. Birth date matches, height matches, but the last name was different, Lopez. At the orphanage, her name had been Janie Morrison. Michael sat back in his leather chair, his hands trembling. Something that hadn't happened since his first hostile takeover. The woman he had promised to marry, the girl who had shared her bread with him when he had nothing, was now working as his housekeeper. Invisible. Silent. Expecting nothing from him, and she hadn't said a word. The man who controlled billions, who could acquire companies with a phone call, who had built an empire on ruthless decisiveness, was suddenly paralyzed by a piece of twisted copper wire and a memory of the one person he had betrayed to get everything he thought he wanted. Michael Robbins stared at the frozen image on his screen, at Janie's hand, at the ring that indicted him more than any courtroom ever could, and realized that all his wealth, all his power, all his control meant absolutely nothing. Because the girl he had abandoned 20 years ago had never taken off his promise. And now she was here. Michael Robbins had perfected the art of destruction by his 35th birthday. Not the messy, emotional kind, nothing so crude. His was surgical, calculated, the sort of ruin that came wrapped in legal documents and delivered by men in tailored suits. He had learned early that sentiment was a liability, that the moment you cared about something, it became leverage someone else could use against you. So he had stopped caring. The firing of his household staff had taken 11 minutes. Rebecca had assembled them in the kitchen at 7 a.m. sharp. The chef, the personal assistant, the driver, the 2 housekeepers, the security coordinator. They had stood in a nervous line, their faces carefully blank, while Michael remained seated at the breakfast table with his espresso and the Wall Street Journal. One of you spoke to the press about my acquisition of the Meridian building, he had said without looking up from the financial section. I don't know which one. I don't particularly care. You're all terminated effective immediately. Rebecca will handle your severance packages. Leave your keys and security badges on the counter. The chef, a man who had worked for Michael for 6 years, had opened his mouth to protest. Michael had finally looked up then, and whatever the chef saw in his eyes had made the words die in his throat. They had filed out in silence, and Michael had returned to his newspaper as if he'd done nothing more significant than delete spam emails. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, Michael had lived alone in 8,000 square feet of architectural perfection. The penthouse had cost $42 million. See floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, a kitchen most restaurants would envy, a master suite larger than most Manhattan apartments. Every surface was marble or rare wood or brushed steel. Every angle had been precisely calculated by award-winning designers. It was a masterpiece. It was also a tomb. The insomnia had started shortly after the firing, though Michael refused to connect the 2 events. Correlation was not causation, his rational mind insisted. He simply needed to optimize his sleep environment. He had the bedroom temperature calibrated to exactly 67 degrees. He invested in blackout curtains that blocked every photon of light. He removed all electronics from the room. He tried white noise machines, then absolute silence. Nothing worked. Night after night, he lay in the darkness, his mind churning through real estate portfolios and market projections and the 1,000 small battles he waged daily to maintain his empire. Sleep, when it came at all, was thin and unsatisfying, full of dreams he couldn't remember, but that left him hollow. His physician, Dr. Warren, had prescribed sleeping pills. Michael had tried them once and hated the chemical fog they left in his mind the next morning. Control was everything. He couldn't afford to be dulled, even for a few hours. You need to address the root cause, Dr. Warren had said during their last appointment. The insomnia is a symptom. What's actually keeping you awake? Michael had written the doctor a check and never returned. By the 3rd week alone, the penthouse had begun to show signs of neglect. Dust gathered on surfaces. The refrigerator contained only bottled water and expired takeout containers. Michael found himself eating dinner, standing at the kitchen counter at midnight, too exhausted to sit, too wired to sleep. He needed staff, but the thought of trusting anyone again made his jaw clench. The leak to the tabloid had been minor, details about a property acquisition that would become public knowledge within weeks anyway. But it was the principle, the violation. Someone in his inner circle had chosen money over loyalty. Michael had built his fortune by eliminating variables he couldn't control, And people, he had learned, were the most unpredictable variables of all. "I need someone who doesn't exist," he had told Rebecca when she presented the new applications. "Someone who won't become a problem." He had meant it as an impossible standard. But Rebecca, efficient as always, had found exactly what he'd demanded. And that was how Janie Lopez had entered his life. Janie Lopez arrived on a Wednesday morning with autumn rain streaking the windows. Michael watched from his office as Rebecca escorted her through the entrance, a woman so unremarkable she seemed designed to be forgotten. Average height, simple charcoal dress, dark hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful. She carried a single worn canvas bag that suggested she owned nothing worth mentioning. She didn't look up, didn't glance around at the $1,000,000 view or the imported Italian marble or the original Rothko on the wall. She simply followed Rebecca like a shadow, her footsteps making no sound on the polished floors. Michael had prepared a speech about his expectations, a list of non-negotiable rules he intended to deliver with the same cold precision he used in boardrooms. But when Rebecca brought Janie to his office doorway, and he opened his mouth to speak, the woman's eyes met his for exactly 1 second. Something in that single second made his prepared words dissolve. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and utterly empty of expectation. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't anything at all. She was waiting, neutral, professional, already gone, even though she stood right in front of him. "The rules are simple," he heard himself say, his voice colder than he'd intended. "No conversation unless I address you directly. No presence in rooms I occupy. No personal effects in common areas. You'll have Sundays off. Any questions?" "No, Mr. Robbins," she said. Her voice was quiet, carefully modulated to carry no emotion whatsoever. That was all. Rebecca showed her to the small staff bedroom off the kitchen, explained the security system and the schedule, and left her to begin. Michael returned to his work, already forgetting the woman existed. Except he couldn't forget. Not because she was memorable, but because she was so thoroughly absent. By midday, the penthouse felt different. Michael couldn't identify what had changed. The furniture hadn't moved. The lighting was the same. Yet something in the air had shifted, as if the space had finally exhaled after holding its breath for weeks. He found himself listening for her, footsteps, the sound of running water, the opening and closing of doors. But there was nothing. Janie moved through the penthouse like smoke, leaving no trace except the evidence of her work. A vase of fresh flowers appeared on the hallway table. The windows gleamed without a single streak. The subtle scent of lavender drifted through the rooms, so faint, Michael wondered if he was imagining it. His lunch appeared on the dining table at exactly 1 o'clock. No announcement, no interruption. Just a simple meal of grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and crusty bread still warm from the oven. Michael stared at the bread for a long moment, a strange tightness in his chest, before forcing himself to eat. The afternoon passed in a blur of conference calls and contract reviews. Michael worked until the sky turned purple, until the city lights began to glitter below like a field of stars. When he finally stood from his desk, his shoulders aching, he found dinner waiting in the kitchen. Another simple meal, nothing fancy, nothing that screamed of effort. Yet every bite tasted like something he couldn't name. Something from before. That night, Michael went through his usual routine. Shower, Egyptian cotton pajamas, the precisely 67-degree bedroom. He lay down expecting the familiar torture of sleeplessness, his mind already beginning its nightly spiral through anxieties and calculations. But the penthouse was quiet, in a way it had never been before. Not empty quiet. Not the suffocating silence of isolation, something else, something almost like presence. Michael's eyes grew heavy. His thoughts began to drift instead of race. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that this was wrong, that he should be alert, that he couldn't afford to let his guard down. But his body was already sinking into the mattress, his breathing already slowing. And for the first time in 3 weeks, Michael Robbins fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. He didn't hear Janie pass by his bedroom door at midnight, carrying fresh linens. He didn't see her pause just for a moment, her hand resting against the doorframe. He didn't see the copper ring on her finger catch the moonlight as she turned away. Michael woke at dawn with the ghost of a dream clinging to his consciousness. Not a nightmare, worse, a memory. He lay still in the gray morning light, his heart beating too fast, trying to force the images back into the locked vault where he kept his past. But they came anyway, relentless as tide. St. Catherine's Home for Children, Baltimore, 20 years ago. The building had been old even then, a converted factory with exposed brick and pipes that clanged and groaned through the winter nights. Michael, though he'd been called something else then, a name he'd worked hard to forget, had arrived at St. Catherine's when he was 7. His mother had dropped him at the front steps with a garbage bag of clothes and a promise to come back. She never did. The older boys ran St. Catherine's, not the exhausted staff. They had their hierarchies, and their territories, their rules. The weak learned quickly to make themselves invisible or pay the price in bruises and stolen meals. Michael had learned to be invisible, until Janie Morrison arrived. She'd been 9, small for her age, with dark eyes that were too old for her face. The social worker had brought her on a February afternoon, and by dinner that first night, the older boys had already marked her as prey. Michael had watched from his corner of the cafeteria as they circled her table, making comments, stealing food from her tray. He should have stayed invisible. That was the smart play. But something about the way she held herself, quiet, dignified, refusing to cry even as they took the last of her dinner roll, had made him stand up. "Leave her alone," he'd said, his voice shaking. The beating had been swift and thorough. They'd left him on the bathroom floor with a split lip and bruised ribs. He dragged himself to the fire escape to hide, to wait until the pain dulled enough to move. That was where Janie had found him. She hadn't said anything, just sat down beside him on the rusted metal grating and carefully unwrapped half a dinner roll from a napkin, the same roll the boys had been stealing from. She must have hidden a piece. "You didn't have to do that," she'd said quietly, breaking the bread in half and offering him a piece. "They were being jerks," Michael had mumbled through his swollen lip. "They're always jerks." She'd looked out at the Baltimore skyline, at the distant lights of the nice neighborhoods where normal families lived in houses with yards and doors that locked. "But you stood up anyway." "That was stupid." "Thanks." "Stupid," she'd repeated, "but brave." They'd eaten the bread in silence, and somehow that had been the beginning. The fire escape became their place. Most nights after lights out, they'd sneak out and sit in the cold, talking about everything and nothing. Janie wanted to be a teacher. Michael wanted to be rich. So rich that nobody could ever hurt him again. So rich that he could help other kids like them. "When I'm rich," he'd said one night, his 11-year-old voice full of certainty, "I'm going to come back and get you out of here." Janie had smiled, but it was a sad smile. "That's a nice dream." "It's not a dream. It's a promise." He'd meant it. And because he'd meant it, he'd wanted to give her something real, something that would prove he wasn't just another person who would forget her. He'd found copper wire in the basement where they kept the broken electrical equipment. He'd found a piece of blue glass from a shattered soda bottle in the dumpster behind the building. For 3 nights, he'd worked on the fire escape, twisting the copper wire around the glass, wrapping it again and again until it held firm, until it looked almost like a real ring. His fingers had blistered and bled, but he'd kept working. On the 4th night, he'd slipped it onto her finger. "When I'm rich," he'd whispered, "I'll marry you. I promise. We'll have a house with a yard and a kitchen with enough food, and nobody will ever hurt us again." Janie had looked at the ring, crude, ugly, worthless, and then at him. In the dim light from the building, her eyes had been bright with tears. "Okay," she'd said simply. "I'll wait for you." 6 weeks later, the Robbins family had come to St. Catherine's looking for a son. They'd wanted someone young enough to mold, smart enough to represent them well, attractive enough to display at country club dinners. Michael had checked all the boxes. "Say goodbye to your friends," Mrs. Robbins had said as they'd led him to their Mercedes. He'd looked back at the building, searching for Janie's face in the windows. He'd found her on the 3rd floor, her palm pressed against the glass, the copper ring visible even from that distance. He'd promised himself he'd come back for her, promised himself he wouldn't forget. But the Robbins family had made it clear. His old life was over. No contact with the orphanage. No looking back. He was their son now, and their son didn't come from places like St. Catherine's. So Michael had buried the boy who'd made promises on fire escapes. He'd buried him so deep, he'd almost convinced himself that person had never existed. Almost. Michael sat up in bed, his hands shaking. The dream, the memory, felt more real than the Egyptian cotton sheets beneath him, more real than the Manhattan penthouse around him. Somewhere in his home, Janie Lopez was moving through rooms like a ghost, and she was wearing his promise on her finger. Michael spent the next 3 days watching Janie through security cameras like a man possessed. Every movement, every gesture, every moment she thought she was alone. He told himself he was being thorough, conducting due diligence. But the truth was simpler and more pathetic. He was a coward. He needed to know if she recognized him, and he was terrified of asking directly. So he devised a test. 3 triggers, 3 memories only the girl from St. Catherine's would recognize. If she was really Janie Morrison, if she knew exactly who he was, she would react. And he would have his answer without ever having to speak the words aloud. The first trigger was almost childishly simple. Michael ordered a case of artisanal soda from a boutique shop in Brooklyn. 12 bottles, each one made with cane sugar and packaged in glass bottles with vintage labels. He had Rebecca arrange them in the kitchen pantry, making sure the blue bottles were placed at eye level, impossible to miss. Blue glass, like the piece he'd used for the ring. That afternoon, Michael positioned himself in his office with a clear view of the kitchen security feed. Janie entered at 2:15 p.m. to prepare his afternoon coffee. She moved with her usual efficiency, pulling down a mug, starting the espresso machine. Then she opened the pantry. Michael leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Janie's hand froze on the pantry door. She stared at the blue bottles for what felt like an eternity. Probably only 5 seconds, but Michael counted each one. Her other hand rose slowly, unconsciously, to touch the ring on her finger. It was just a brief touch, there and gone, before she closed the pantry and continued making his coffee. But it was enough. She'd seen it. She'd remembered. The second trigger took more planning. Michael had Rebecca compile a playlist for the penthouse sound system, soft background music for working, she'd told Janie, classical pieces, jazz standards, nothing remarkable. Except for track 17, a recording of Amazing Grace, performed by the St. Catherine's Home Children's Choir circa 2004. Michael had found the recording in a digital archive of Baltimore charity events. The audio quality was poor, the children's voices thin and uncertain, but it was unmistakably St. Catherine's. He'd sung in that choir. So had Janie. He waited until evening, until Janie was setting the table for his dinner. Then he activated the playlist from his office, skipping directly to track 17. The children's voices filled the penthouse, ghostly and innocent. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Through the camera, Michael watched Janie freeze with a wineglass in her hand, her head tilted slightly, listening, her lips parted. For a moment, just a moment, her carefully maintained mask of professional neutrality cracked, and Michael saw grief flash across her face like lightning. Then, she set down the glass, walked calmly to the sound system panel, and turned the volume down to barely audible. She returned to setting the table as if nothing had happened, but her hands were shaking. The third trigger was the cruelest, and Michael hated himself for using it. He had his private investigator track down a photograph from St. Catherine's archives. It had taken 2 days and a substantial bribe to someone at the Baltimore City Records office, but he'd gotten it. A group photo from February 2005 taken on the fire escape for some forgotten newsletter. Michael printed the photo and left it on the kitchen counter, face up, as if he'd carelessly abandoned it there. Then he watched. Janie found it while cleaning up after breakfast. She picked it up, probably intending to file it away with his other papers. Then she saw what it was. Every muscle in her body went rigid. She stood motionless for so long that Michael thought the camera feed had frozen. But then, he saw her chest rise and fall, too fast, her breathing labored. The photo showed a group of children on a fire escape. Front and center were 2 kids, a scrawny boy with haunted eyes and a small girl with too serious face. The boy's arm was around the girl's shoulders. They were both trying to smile for the camera, but neither quite managed it. Janie's finger traced the outline of the girl in the photo. Then, the boy. She turned the photo over. On the back, someone had written in faded marker, St. Catherine's Home, Fire Escape Friends, February 2005. She stood there for 3 full minutes, just holding the photograph. Then, very carefully, she set it back exactly where she'd found it and walked away. But not before Michael saw her wipe her eyes. That night, Michael sat in his office with the lights off, staring at nothing. He had his answer. Janie knew exactly who he was. She had known from the moment she walked through his door. She had worn his ring every single day for 20 years, and she had chosen to stay silent. The question that kept him awake now, that gnawed at him like a physical wound, was simple and impossible. Why? Why hadn't she said anything? Why had she let him pretend not to recognize her? Why had she protected his cowardice with her silence? Michael looked down at his hands, the hands that had built an empire, that signed deals worth billions, that had pushed every human connection away in pursuit of control. These same hands had once twisted copper wire for a girl who'd shared her bread with him when he had nothing, and now he couldn't even find the courage to speak her name. The answer came to Michael on the 7th night, not in a moment of clarity, but in a slow, crushing wave of understanding that left him unable to breathe. He was in his office reviewing contracts he'd read 3 times already, unable to concentrate, when he heard Janie moving through the penthouse. It was past midnight. She should have been in her room, but instead she was doing what she always did, erasing evidence of his existence, folding the blanket he'd left on the couch, rinsing the coffee cup he'd abandoned in the sink, moving through his space like a ghost, making everything perfect, making herself invisible. That word stopped him. Invisible. "I need someone who doesn't exist," he told Rebecca. "Someone invisible." And Rebecca had found Janie. Janie, who had perfected the art of disappearing. Janie, who had spent 15 years working for Manhattan's elite families without a single one remembering her face. Janie, who had somehow found him after all these years and applied for a job in his home without ever speaking his name. Michael stood and walked to his office door, watching her through the gap. She was wiping down the kitchen counters with mechanical precision, her movements efficient and emotionless. The copper ring caught the under-cabinet lighting, winking at him like an accusation. Then it hit him with the force of a physical blow. She'd made herself invisible for him, not because she was naturally forgettable, not because she lacked personality or presence, but because she'd learned, probably the hard way. Was he probably through years of being dismissed and overlooked, that powerful people didn't want to be reminded of where they came from. They wanted servants who wouldn't trigger their guilt, who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions, who would let them pretend their pasts had never existed. Janie had given him exactly what he had asked for, the gift of invisibility, the permission to continue lying to himself. She could have walked into his penthouse and said his real name, the one from St. Catherine's, the one he'd buried along with the boy who made promises on fire escapes. She could have held up her hand and shown him the ring and asked why he'd never come back for her. She could have demanded an explanation, an apology, anything. Instead, she'd protected him, protected his carefully constructed identity as Michael Robbins, billionaire, the man with no past worth mentioning. She'd let him pretend not to recognize her. She'd absorbed his coldness, his rules about silence and invisibility, and she'd never once made him face what he'd done. Michael's hands clenched into fists. The realization was worse than any accusation could have been, because Janie's silence wasn't forgiveness. It was something far more devastating. It was resignation. She'd stopped expecting anything from him years ago, maybe decades ago. She'd waited, wearing his ring, hoping he'd keep his promise. And at some point, maybe after the first year, maybe after 5, maybe after 10, she'd accepted that the boy who'd stood up for her was gone, dead, replaced by a man who built empires by forgetting where he came from. So when she'd somehow found him, she somehow learned that the ruthless Michael Robbins was the same scared kid who'd twisted copper wire on a fire escape. She hadn't confronted him. She'd simply adapted. She'd applied for a job as his housekeeper, knowing exactly who he was, knowing he wouldn't recognize her, or worse, that he'd pretend not to. She'd made it easy for him, because that's what she'd learned powerful people wanted: ease, comfort, freedom from guilt. Michael thought about the blue bottles, the choir song, the photograph. He'd thought he was testing her, but she'd known what he was doing. Of course she had. And she'd reacted just enough to let him know she understood, but not enough to force his hand. She'd given him every opportunity to acknowledge her, to speak, to apologize, and he'd chosen cowardice every single time. The truly unbearable part was understanding why she'd done it. Not for money. She could work for anyone in Manhattan. Not for revenge. She could have gone to the tabloids, exposed the orphan boy behind the billionaire mask. She'd done it because somewhere, buried beneath 20 years of silence and resignation, she still cared about him. The girl who'd shared her bread still existed inside the woman who cleaned his floors. And she was protecting him the same way she had protected him in St. Catherine's, by taking the hit herself, by making herself small, by asking for nothing. Michael walked back to his desk and sat down, his legs suddenly unable to hold him. The contracts blurred in front of his eyes. Somewhere in his penthouse, Janie was finishing her invisible work, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, demanding nothing. She'd given him the gift of invisibility, the gift of a past that didn't have to exist unless he chose to acknowledge it. And Michael finally understood. That gift was the most damning indictment of all, because Janie Lopez had learned that the boy she'd loved had become a man who needed her not to exist, and she'd loved him enough, or pitied him enough, to grant him that wish, even while wearing his promise on her finger. The question now was whether Michael Robbins had the courage to reject that gift, to tear off the mask, to bleed. He looked at the security feed, at the woman moving through his home like a ghost he'd created, and he realized he was terrified. The Manhattan Children's Foundation Gala was held at the Plaza Hotel in a ballroom that dripped with crystal chandeliers and old money. 300 of New York's most influential people gathered in designer gowns and custom tuxedos, writing checks that would ease their tax burdens while making them feel philanthropic. Michael attended every year. It was expected, required, part of the performance of being Michael Robbins. This year, he'd brought Janie, not as his date. God, no, that would raise too many questions. but his household staff was required to assist with coat check and guest services, a subtle display of wealth and generosity that the foundation appreciated. Rebecca had arranged everything. Janie would work the coat room for the first hour, then be available if Michael needed anything during the evening. Michael told himself it was a reasonable request, efficient, practical. The truth was messier. He wanted her there, wanted her in his orbit, wanted to watch her move through his world and see if she'd finally crack, finally demand recognition, finally force him to acknowledge what he'd been too cowardly to say. He was still testing her, still hiding. He disgusted himself. Victoria Ashford arrived fashionably late, making an entrance in a scarlet gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. She was old money turned into new aggression, a real estate developer whose family legacy had given her a head start that she mistook for superiority. 6 months ago, Michael had rejected her proposal for a joint development in Brooklyn. The deal had been bad, the numbers inflated, and he'd said no without hesitation. Victoria didn't take rejection well. Michael saw her scanning the ballroom the moment she entered, her eyes predatory and calculating. When her gaze landed on him, her smile was all teeth and no warmth. She began moving through the crowd in his direction, collecting allies and champagne as she went. "Michael Robbins," she said when she reached him, her voice honey-sweet and poisonous. "Still attending these things? I thought you'd be too busy crushing small businesses to pretend you care about children." "Victoria," Michael replied evenly, "still bitter about Brooklyn. I thought you'd have found someone else's money to lose by now." Her smile tightened. Around them, conversations quieted. People sensed blood in the water. "I heard you fired your entire staff," Victoria continued, her voice carrying across the immediate area. "Trust issues? Or did you finally realize that money can't buy loyalty?" "I prefer competence to loyalty," Michael said. "It's more reliable." "How very cold." Victoria's eyes glittered with malice. "Though I suppose that's your brand, isn't it? The man without a heart, the billionaire who came from nowhere and owes nothing to anyone." There was something calculated in her tone, something that made Michael's instincts flare. This wasn't random society gossip. Victoria was building to something. "I came from hard work," Michael said carefully, "same as anyone." "Really?" Victoria tilted her head, mock curious. "Because I did some digging after you embarrassed me on that Brooklyn deal. Nothing too invasive, just curious about your background, your origin story. And you know what's fascinating?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I can't imagine. There's almost nothing. Before the Robbins family adopted you at 11, you barely exist. Like you were invented from scratch." She paused, letting the implication hang. "Almost like you're ashamed of where you came from." Several people were openly watching now. Michael felt the walls closing in, felt the boy from St. Catherine's clawing at the inside of his chest, demanding to be heard. "My past is my own," he said quietly, "and irrelevant to my work." "Is it, though?" Victoria's smile widened. "I mean, you clearly like to keep your former life very separate, very invisible." She turned, scanning the room as if looking for something. "Speaking of invisible, where is your new help? I wanted to meet the woman brave enough to work for Manhattan's most ruthless employer." Michael's blood went cold. That's unnecessary." "Oh, I insist. I believe she's working coat check?" Victoria was already moving toward the entrance hall, her entourage flowing with her like a poisonous tide. "I simply must compliment her on her patience. Working for you can't be easy." Michael followed, his heart hammering. Around them, curious guests trailed along, sensing drama. This was entertainment for them. A show. They found Janie in the coat room, hanging a guest's fur with quiet efficiency. She looked up as the crowd approached, her face carefully neutral, professionally blank. Victoria's eyes locked onto her, and something vicious sparked in her expression. "You must be Michael's new housekeeper," Victoria said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "How quaint. Tell me, dear, what's it like working for a man who treats people like disposable assets? Does he even know your name?" Janie's eyes flickered to Michael for just a fraction of a second. In that glance, he saw a question, a plea, a final chance. "Say something," her eyes whispered. "Acknowledge me. Choose me." Michael opened his mouth. No words came. Victoria's smile turned triumphant. She'd seen the exchange, sensed the weakness, found the wound to press. "Oh my God," Victoria said slowly, realization dawning across her face like sunrise. "There's a story here, isn't there? Something our heartless billionaire doesn't want anyone to know." She turned to the growing crowd, her voice dripping with theatrical excitement. This should be interesting. And Michael knew, with absolute certainty, that everything was about to shatter. Victoria moved closer to Janie, her predator's instinct honed on the kill. The crowd pressed in, a semicircle of diamonds and designer labels, all hungry for scandal. "Let me guess," Victoria said, circling Janie like a shark. "You knew our Michael from before, didn't you? Before the Robbins family plucked him from obscurity and gave him a name worth having?" She glanced back at Michael. "What was it? Foster care? Juvenile detention? Some sad little orphanage in Baltimore?" Michael's entire body went rigid. She'd done her homework, done it well. "That's enough, Victoria," he said, but his voice came out strangled, weak. "Oh, I don't think it is." Victoria's attention snapped back to Janie, who stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression carefully empty. "You're being awfully quiet, dear. Cat got your tongue? Or are you just well-trained?" She reached out suddenly, grabbing Janie's left hand. "What's this? Jewelry? I didn't think Michael paid well enough for—" She stopped, stared at the copper ring. Her face transformed from cruel amusement to delighted shock. "Oh my God," Victoria breathed. Is this copper wire?" She held Janie's hand up for the crowd to see, her voice rising with theatrical glee. "Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Robbins' housekeeper is wearing a ring made of garbage. How delightfully pathetic." "Let go of her," Michael said, finding his voice at last. But Victoria was already twisting the ring off Janie's finger. Janie didn't resist, didn't fight back, just let it happen, with that same terrible resignation Michael had seen for weeks. The ring came free, and Victoria held it up to the light like a specimen. "Look at this," she announced to the crowd. "This is what passes for jewelry in Michael's household. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. A man who came from nothing, pretending to be something. Give it back." Michael's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade. Victoria turned to him, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Sorry? I didn't quite catch that." "Give it back." Something in his tone made the crowd go silent. Victoria's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered, her grip tightening on the ring. "Why? What is this thing to you, Michael? Some kind of reminder of your poverty? A little memento of the orphan boy you used to be?" Her voice dripped with venom. "Or maybe it means something more? Maybe this cheap little trinket connects you to—" She looked at Janie, then at Michael. Understanding bloomed across her face like poison flowers. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, this is even better than I thought." Then she threw the ring. It arced through the air, a flash of oxidized copper and chipped blue glass, and clattered onto the marble floor. It bounced once, twice, and skittered toward the center of the ballroom, where 300 pairs of expensive shoes surrounded it. "Oops," Victoria said. "How clumsy of me." Michael didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't consider the cost or the consequences, or what this would do to his carefully constructed image. He moved. The crowd parted as he walked past them, his eyes fixed on the copper ring lying on the marble like a fallen star. He was aware of the silence, the shock, the 300 witnesses to his unraveling. He was aware of Janie behind him, probably watching with those 2 old eyes, probably already preparing to disappear from his life forever. He was aware of everything and nothing as he dropped to his knees on the ballroom floor. The marble was cold and hard beneath him. His custom tuxedo, worth more than most people earned in a month, pressed against the ground. Around him, he heard gasps, whispers, the sharp intake of 300 collective breaths. Michael Robbins, Manhattan's most ruthless billionaire, was on his knees. He picked up the ring carefully, reverently, as if it were made of glass that might shatter. The copper felt warm in his palm, worn smooth by 20 years of Janie wearing it every single day. The blue glass caught the chandelier light and threw fractured rainbows across his hand. He stood slowly, turned to face the crowd. Found Janie's face among them, her eyes wide, her carefully maintained mask finally cracking. "This ring," Michael said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "is worth more than every diamond in this room, more than every deal I've ever closed, more than every dollar in my accounts." Victoria laughed nervously. "Michael, you're being ridiculous." "I made this ring 20 years ago," he continued, ignoring her. "I was 11 years old. I was nobody. I had nothing. But I had a friend who shared her bread with me when I was hungry, who sat with me on fire escapes and listened to my dreams, who believed I could be something more than a scared orphan boy." He walked toward Janie. The crowd parted like water. "I promised her," he said, his eyes locked on Janie's, "that when I was rich, I would marry her. I promised I would come back for her. I promised I wouldn't forget." He stopped in front of her, close enough to see the tears gathering in her eyes, close enough to see her hands trembling. "And then I broke every promise I made." His voice cracked. "I let a wealthy family convince me that my past was something to erase, that the boy who made this ring should die so Michael Robbins could live. I abandoned you. I forgot you. I chose money and status and a name over the one person who ever loved me when I was nothing. A tear slid down Janie's cheek. Just one. But it destroyed him. Michael held out the ring. His hand was shaking. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said quietly. I don't deserve another chance. But I need you to know that every night for 20 years I couldn't sleep because some part of me remembered. Some part of me knew I'd traded my soul for an empire built on lies. He took her hand gently. She didn't pull away. This ring is worth more than anything I own, he said, his voice breaking, because it's the only promise I ever made that mattered. And I'm 20 years too late, but if you'll let me, if you can possibly forgive me, I'd like to finally keep it. The ballroom held its breath. Michael slipped the copper ring back onto Janie's finger, where it belonged, where it had always belonged. And then, in front of 300 witnesses, the man without a heart finally started to bleed. Michael woke the next morning to silence. Not the comfortable silence Janie had brought to his penthouse, the quiet that felt like peace, like presence. This was the old silence, the suffocating kind, the silence of emptiness and absence and rooms that echoed with everything he'd lost. He knew before he got out of bed, knew before he walked through the penthouse calling her name, knew before he checked the staff quarters and found them stripped bare, no clothes, no bag, no evidence she'd ever existed, except for the faint scent of lavender that still clung to the air like a ghost. She was gone. On the kitchen counter, weighted down by the blue glass bottle he'd left as a test, was an envelope. His name written in careful, precise handwriting across the front, just Michael. Not Mr. Robbins, not Sir. Michael. And his hands shook as he opened it. Dear Michael, I need you to understand something. Last night when you knelt in front of all those people and told them our story, it was the bravest thing I've ever seen you do. For a moment I saw the boy from the fire escape again, the one who stood up for me even though he knew he'd get hurt, the one who made me a ring from garbage and called it a promise. But here's what you need to know. I'm not the girl who waits anymore. I waited for you for 5 years. Every day at St. Catherine's after you left, I sat on that fire escape wearing your ring and told myself you'd come back. I made excuses for you. You were adjusting to your new life. You were busy with school. You'd come when you could. After 5 years, I aged out of the system. No adoption, no family. Just me and a garbage bag of belongings and a copper ring I couldn't bring myself to take off. I worked 3 jobs. I put myself through community college. I learned to be invisible because being seen as an orphan, as someone from nowhere, meant people treated you like you were worth nothing. I saw your name in the paper 8 years ago. Michael Robbins, real estate mogul, closing his first major deal. I recognized your face even though you'd grown up, even though you'd become someone else. And I understood then that the boy who made me promises had died. Or maybe he'd never really existed. Maybe I'd invented him because I was lonely and hungry and desperate to believe someone cared. But I kept the ring. And I built a life around being invisible, around serving people who would never see me, because at least it was honest. At least I wasn't pretending to be something I wasn't. When I found out you needed a housekeeper, I told myself I just wanted to see you once, just once, to know if any part of that boy remained. I didn't expect you to recognize me. I didn't expect anything, and you gave me exactly what I expected. Nothing. You tested me with blue bottles and songs and photographs like I was a puzzle to solve, a problem to manage. You watched me through cameras instead of talking to me. You kept your distance, kept your control, kept your carefully constructed life intact. And I let you, because I'd learned that's what people like you need, permission to stay comfortable. Last night, you finally spoke. You finally chose. And it was beautiful and terrible and 20 years too late. I won't be the woman who waits for you to become brave enough to love her. I won't be the proof that you can buy redemption with a public confession. I won't be the project you fix to feel better about yourself. I deserve more than that. I deserve someone who chooses me first, not last. Not after 20 years. Not after I've already learned to live without them. I'm keeping the ring, not because I'm waiting, not because I believe in promises anymore, but because it reminds me that I survived loving someone who forgot me. And if I survived that, I can survive anything. I hope you find peace, Michael. I hope you learn to sleep. I hope you build something real instead of just building empire after empire to fill the space where your heart should be. But I won't be part of that journey. I can't be. I'm done waiting. Janie Michael read the letter 3 times, then 4, then lost count. The sun rose over Manhattan, while painting his penthouse in shades of gold and amber. The city woke up below him, 8 million people going about their lives, pursuing their dreams, building their futures. His phone buzzed with emails and messages. The markets opened. His empire continued its relentless expansion, and none of it mattered. Michael Robbins owned half of the East Coast's most valuable real estate. His net worth exceeded what most people could imagine. He had power, influence, respect. He had everything he'd ever thought he wanted when he was 11 years old and hungry and desperate to be someone. But Janie was gone. And without her, all of it, every dollar, every property, every achievement, was just a monument to the boy he'd killed, a gravestone marking where his soul used to be. He looked at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, saw a man in expensive pajamas standing in a $42 million tomb, holding a letter that explained exactly how worthless he'd become. The copper ring was gone. Janie was gone. And Michael realized too late that he'd spent 20 years building an empire on the grave of the only thing that had ever mattered. He'd finally learned to bleed. But there was no one left to see it. Michael found her 3 days later in Queens, not through private investigators or security cameras or any of the tools his wealth provided. He found her the old way, by calling every employment agency in the city, by asking questions, by following leads through neighborhoods his Manhattan circles would never acknowledge existed, by walking streets in a borrowed jacket instead of his tailored suits, because Janie had been right about one thing: the billionaire mask needed to die. Her apartment was in a modest building with cracked concrete steps and a front door that didn't quite close properly. 3rd floor, Unit 3C. Michael stood outside that door for 10 minutes, his heart hammering, before he finally knocked. Janie opened it wearing jeans and an old sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger somehow, lighter, free. When she saw him, her expression closed like a door slamming shut. "No," she said simply, and started to close the door. Michael put his hand against it, not forcing, just asking. "Please," he said, 5 minutes. "If you still want me to leave after that, I will, I promise. And I'm finally learning what promises mean." Something in his voice, maybe the rawness, maybe the exhaustion, made her hesitate. She studied his face, and Michael let her look. Let her see the sleepless nights, the hollow cheeks, the man who'd stopped pretending he was okay. 5 minutes, she said finally, stepping back. Her apartment was small, a studio with a kitchenette and a futon and windows that overlooked a bodega. It was nothing like his penthouse, no marble, no floor-to-ceiling views, no imported anything. It looked like home. "I read your letter about 100 times, Michael said, standing awkwardly in the middle of her space. "You were right about everything. I tested you instead of talking to you. I hid behind cameras and wealth and control because I was terrified. I am terrified of being seen, of being the orphan boy again, of being someone who can be abandoned. Michael, I'm not here to ask you to come back," he continued quickly. "I'm not here to offer you money or convince you to give me another chance I don't deserve. I'm here to tell you that I quit." Janie blinked. "What?" "I quit. I sold my company." "Well, most of it. I kept enough to live on, to be comfortable. But the empire, the penthouse, the obsessive need to control everything, gone." He pulled out a folded newspaper from his jacket, handed it to her. The headline read, "Manhattan mogul stuns industry with massive sell-off." Janie stared at the paper, then at him. "You sold your company. Because you were right. I was building monuments to a dead boy instead of becoming someone worth knowing. And I realized I don't want to be Michael Robbins, billionaire with no past. I don't want to be the man without a heart." He swallowed hard. "I want to be the kid who made you a ring on a fire escape, the one who believed in promises, and I can't be that person while hiding in a $42 million cage." "So what?" Janie's voice was sharp, defensive. "You think selling your company means you've changed? You think grand gestures fix 20 years? "No," Michael said quietly. "That's why I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just asking for permission to try. Not to fix the past, I can't do that, but to build something real going forward." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. He held it out to her. Janie unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a ring, copper wire, clumsily twisted. Instead of blue glass, it held a small piece of turquoise, still imperfect, still rough, but carefully chosen. The wirework was amateur, uneven. His fingers had blistered making it. "It's terrible," Michael said. "I'm out of practice. My hands are softer than they used to be. But I made it myself. No assistance, no help. Just me, sitting in a workshop in Brooklyn for 2 days, trying to remember how." Janie turned the ring over in her palm, her eyes bright with tears. "I'm not asking you to marry me," Michael continued. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking if I can spend however long it takes proving that the boy who made you the first ring still exists, that he's worth knowing, that he can learn to be brave enough to deserve you." Michael, her voice broke. I bought a brownstone 2 blocks from here, he said. Nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms. Needs work. I thought maybe I could fix it up. Learn to use my hands for building instead of destroying. And maybe, if you're willing, you could teach me how to be human again. Not as my employee, not as someone I'm fixing or saving, as someone who might, possibly eventually be my friend, and maybe someday more. But only if you want. Only when you're ready. Only if I can prove I'm worth the risk. Janie looked at the ring, at Michael, at the newspaper announcing the death of his empire. You really sold everything, she whispered. Not everything. I kept enough. But enough isn't the same as too much. I'm learning the difference. He managed a small, sad smile. Turns out I don't need an empire. I just needed to remember who I was before I built one. For a long moment, Janie didn't speak. She just stood there, holding the clumsy copper ring, tears sliding down her cheeks. Then she put the ring on her right hand. Not her left, not yet. But not in a drawer. Not forgotten. On her finger. Where she could see it. Where she could decide what it meant. 2 blocks away? She asked finally. 2 blocks, I checked. And you're really going to fix it up yourself? You who probably hasn't held a hammer in 20 years? I'll probably be terrible at it, Michael admitted. I'll definitely hit my thumb a lot, but I want to try. I want to build something real with my own hands. Janie shook her head, half laughing, half crying. You're insane. Probably, but I'm finally done being a coward. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not his housekeeper or the girl from the orphanage, but the woman she'd become. Strong, independent. Someone who'd survived without him and built a life from nothing. You said you deserved someone who chooses you first. You're right, and I can't undo the past, but I can choose you now, every day, for however long you'll let me try to become the man who deserves to be chosen back. Janie wiped her eyes, studying him for a long moment. Then she took a shaky breath. Okay, she said softly. Okay? Okay, you can try, but I'm not promising anything, and I'm not waiting anymore. If you mess this up, if you hide or run or forget who you are, I'm done, for real this time. I understand. And you're going to actually learn to use a hammer. None of this hiring contractors pretending you did the work. I promise. Stop making promises, Janie said, but she was almost smiling. Start keeping them instead. Michael nodded. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, to prove through touch that he was real and present and here. But he'd spent 20 years taking what he wanted without earning it. So he kept his hands at his sides and just looked at her. The girl who'd shared her bread, the woman who'd refused to wait, the person who'd always been worth bleeding for. I'm going to mess this up sometimes, he said honestly. I'm going to forget how to be human. I'm going to slip back into control and fear. I know, but I'm going to try, every day, to be worthy of you. Janie looked at the 2 rings on her fingers now, the old copper and glass on her left hand, the new copper and turquoise on her right, 20 years between them. 2 promises, 1 broken, and 1 just beginning. Then try, she said, and in her voice, Michael heard something he hadn't heard in 20 years. Hope, not certainty, not forgiveness, not love, not yet, but hope. And for the first time since he'd knelt on a ballroom floor, Michael Robbins understood that hope was enough. Hope was where everything real began. He smiled. She almost smiled back. And somewhere above them, in a city of 8 million people all trying to become someone better than they were yesterday, a copper ring caught the afternoon light and gleamed like a second chance, like a promise finally worth keeping. Brr. Before you click away, let me ask you something. Have you ever made a promise to someone you loved and broke it? Have you ever abandoned someone who believed in you because it was easier than staying? Have you ever built a life so perfect on the outside that you forgot who you were on the inside? Michael spent 20 years running from a copper ring, 20 years hiding from the boy he used to be, 20 years building an empire on top of a grave, and it almost cost him everything. But here's the truth, most people won't tell you. It's never too late to choose courage over comfort. It's never too late to stop hiding. It's never too late to become the person you promised you'd be. If this story touched you, if you saw yourself in Michael's cowardice or Janie's strength, then you owe it to yourself to do 3 things. 1. Hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this remind us that wealth without integrity is just expensive emptiness, and you need that reminder. We all do. 2. Leave a comment telling me, who is your Janie? Who did you make a promise to that you haven't kept? You don't have to use their real name. Just acknowledge it. Because the first step to keeping a promise is admitting you broke it. 3. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. That friend who's been running from their past. That family member who's forgotten where they came from. That person who's built walls so high they can't see the people they've left behind. Because here's what I know. Someone watching this right now is wearing their own copper ring, waiting for someone to finally choose them, waiting for someone to stop being a coward, and someone else watching this is that coward, hiding behind success, behind busyness, behind excuses. Which one are you? Don't scroll past this moment. Don't tell yourself you'll think about it later. Don't let another day go by building monuments to a person you're ashamed to be. Subscribe, comment, share. Because the boy or girl you used to be, the one who made promises on fire escapes and believed in something bigger than money, is still in there, waiting for you to finally be brave enough to remember. Don't make them wait another 20 years. The subscribe button is right there. What are you waiting for?